In this lecture, we bring together many of the things that we have learned so far in this section in order to create something that we call visual hierarchy. So, let's see what visual hierarchy is all about. And essentially, visual hierarchy is all about establishing which elements of a certain design are the most important ones. So that's exactly what hierarchy means, right? So essentially, we need to establish a hierarchy of elements in order to draw attention to the most important ones of these elements. And doing this is actually one of the best ways to make a layout actually look designed. So oftentimes an interface looks way more pleasing simply because the visual hierarchy is very well thought out and conveyed to the user. But before moving on, let's quickly look at an example here. Now, even without having learned anything about visual hierarchy, we can kind of intuitively see that the photos in the top and the booking box draw the most attention on this page, right? And so, again, establishing visual hierarchy is basically giving more prominence to these more important elements. And the reason why it is this way is that the visual hierarchy has been correctly established by a combination of position, colors, shadow, border, and other elements. And so that's why I also said that this lecture is basically going to be a culmination of everything that we have learned before. But anyway, moving on a little bit, visual hierarchy is also about defining a path for our users in order to guide them through the page in an intuitive and kind of automatic way. So imagine that a user enters this page. The attention will probably immediately fall on this big block of images here. Then, after that, the attention will go to this other important element, such as we had highlighted before, right? Then from there, it might go to this button because of the very bright color, and only then the attention of the user might jump here to the center part. So to the top probably of this part, and then here going down a little bit further, reading all this text, and only then in the very end, the attention might jump finally to this very small element that is here at the very bottom and with a small text. So as I had briefly mentioned already, what we do in order to establish a meaningful visual hierarchy is to use a combination of position, size, colors, spacing, borders, and shadows. And so, the goal of this lecture is basically to show you how you can do exactly that. So, establishing a good visual hierarchy between elements and components. Now, just as another example, imagine that we didn't have borders and shadows in this example. So then it would look like this, and all of a sudden the flow that we had before would be kind of lost. So the user maybe wouldn't really know anymore where to look after scanning the images. However, we do want our user to go to that reserve box, and so that's why this element was before featured so prominently. But anyway, we can even take it one step further by even removing the color from this component. And so now the visual hierarchy is completely lost, and the interface all of a sudden doesn't look so well designed anymore, right? So just 2 or 3 simple changes that we did here, and suddenly the design has a completely different look and feel. But of course, we want to avoid that when creating our own designs. And so let's now go learn how. So, starting with the very fundamentals, the first guideline that I have for you is that you should position important elements closer to the top of the page, because that is where they get the most attention. So people usually read a page from top to bottom, and so therefore elements that appear first on a page, so closer to the top, will naturally get more attention. Now, of course, there are many other factors involved in drawing attention, so not just the position related to the top of the page, but in general, attention flows from the top to bottom, so basically just like a river. and that applies to the overall page, but also to individual components. So in this example here, the first thing that the user might maybe notice is that logo there, then the navigation, and then immediately it will go for this main heading here. And so since this is the most important heading, it should be as close as possible to the top of the page. Then from there, attention will of course keep flowing down. And here we also see that we have this really important call to action button. And so your very first call to action button should also be as close as possible to the top of the page. Now, next up, it's important to be aware of the fact that images draw a lot of attention. And so therefore, you need to use them mindfully. So in this small component, the attention will probably immediately fall on the image and only then go here to this heading and then to the button. And so if we really wanted our user to read the text, then maybe we should consider not using the image at all or making a smaller image, because smaller images draw a little bit less attention. Then the next one here is from Instagram, where probably this first profile picture draws the most attention, and then from there it will immediately go down here to these images, and maybe then from there the attention might flow back up to these other information like followers, description, and so on and so forth. Another way to emphasize elements or groups of elements is to use whitespace strategically. So as we learned before, whitespace creates separation between elements or groups of elements, and so therefore it is also extremely important in order to correctly define a visual hierarchy. So for example, in these two designs, they have a lot of whitespace around this most important part of this page. So on the left especially, there is a ton of whitespace basically around this sign up form, while on the right side, there is a huge amount of whitespace between the two rows and also really around these 5 feature blocks. Now, I don't mean, of course, that you should always surround everything with this much whitespace. Just follow the rules that we learned previously about whitespace and you're going to be fine. The point here is just that we can use whitespace strategically in order to make important elements stand out. Okay, and now we're going to start focusing only on text elements. So learning how and when we can make different text elements more or less prominent, because this is actually one of the most important things of doing visual hierarchy on a smaller level. So for example, inside of a component. So for text elements, we can use a combination of font size, font weight, color, and whitespace to give elements different levels of importance. And by color, I mean both text color and background color, like for example on buttons. And let's study again the example from the beginning. So this one here. And so at the very beginning, we have no hierarchy at all. All the text has the same size, the same weight and color. Only a little bit of white space has already been added. Now, as a first step of improving this, we can increase the font size a little bit on the title, which is the most important piece of content here. Next up, we can increase the font weight, for example, on the location, the heading again, and also the rating of 5.0. So this is looking quite nice already. There is definitely a lot more visual hierarchy than before, but we can even make this better to make it perfect. So basically, the final step is to lighten some of the colors in order to give them a little bit less importance. So here, the superhost label, the location, and also the number of ratings has actually been lightened in order to give them less prominence than the rest of the content. And let's check out another example here, which is this one, where at the beginning all the text is at 20 pixels and there is no hierarchy at all. There's no white space, no color, no font weight, and really nothing. So in order to improve this, we can change the font sizes a little bit and add some white space. So now there are a lot of different font sizes here according to the importance of each of the elements. So already looking a lot better, but to make it perfect, we can also add some font weight and some color. So what we did here was to emphasize some of these elements by making them bold. Then we added also some color to emphasize this link. And finally, we once again made some less important text a little bit lighter. And so with this, it becomes de-emphasized, which is a technique that we use all the time to build a nice visual hierarchy like this one. So the content is the same, but compare the left with the right design. It's really all about using these techniques in order to establish a visual hierarchy. Nothing more and nothing less than that. And all of a sudden, it looks really well designed, doesn't it? And since this is so important, let's look at a couple of other examples, but this time analyzing only the flow. So here it's probably again the image who is going to draw the most attention, and only then our eyes are going to move to that headline here, and followed then by this colored button here in the bottom. So this has this eye-catching background color, and therefore it draws a lot more attention than the text that is between the headline and this button. Then we might look at the price and the other pieces of content that are here. Now, of course, these flows will be different for different people, but I'm just describing what I think makes more sense for the average user. Then another example of a well-designed visual hierarchy is this one, where again we start at the very top, but then our bright blue button here in the bottom will draw our attention. From there, we might move to this bold text here. So again, the font weight is used here in order to draw attention, right? And only then, in the end, we might go to this de-emphasized text, which is a bit lighter and also has less font weight. Then another one where we have a more classical top to bottom flow. However, that small and light subtitle that says work 03 is not really drawing any attention because it's so light and so thin and small. So that's why we skipped it, because I think that many users will actually skip that and jump straight into the headline with their attention. Now here then we have this nice and subtle background color, which makes this piece of content stand out a little bit. So otherwise maybe the attention would immediately go to that image, but like this, maybe we will first stop here, and then after that, we might look at the image and then the rest of the content here. Finally, just another one. And well, here we just start here with this really big text. Then probably we might go to this text that is a little bit smaller. And then here we have this bright color, which I think draws a lot of attention. And so I think the attention might jump there next. And only then we go to this small text, followed by this other even smaller text that's right here at the bottom. So here in this example, once again, you can really start seeing now why designers took the decisions that they did with the size, weight, color, and also white space. So all these components are really well designed, and therefore the visual hierarchy is also top-notch. And so again, nothing here is random. All the design decisions make sense because the designer wanted to establish a visual hierarchy to guide the user. But now you might ask, what elements should we actually emphasize? Well, we should emphasize contents like titles, subtitles, links, buttons, data points, and icons. And as we already saw in all the previous examples, we can also de-emphasize less important text, so things like labels or simply secondary information. So again, that example that we worked on previously, here we have the title, which is really emphasized. We have an icon, which is emphasized by the color. Then we have a really important data point, which is this rating, and that's why it is bold. Here is a link. And finally, there is some less important text here, so some additional information that on purpose we made lighter in order to de-emphasize it. All right. So these are basically the types of text that are important to think about when we create visual hierarchy. And let's take a look at a couple of more examples. So again, icon, subtitle, and link. And here we have subtitle and the title and the icon. And also the subtitle here. And I'm going through these examples a lot faster now because, as I mentioned before, I actually want you to download these lectures as PDF slides so that you can then study them on your own and get a lot of inspiration for when you start building your own designs. So you shouldn't just watch this video and call it a day. It's very important to also really analyze all of these examples one by one, because I did choose them very, very carefully with tens or probably hundreds of hours of research. All right. But anyway, let's take a look at a couple more. So here again, we have a subtitle and a couple of very important data points. So in this case, that's prices. And so therefore, they are bold and bigger than the rest of the text. And I think they're even darker. Then here we also have some additional information once again. So just telling customers that this is for European cards. And therefore, this text is a lot lighter and also smaller. Then here, these icons are apparently quite important, which is why they got this nice attention-grabbing color. And then finally, there is this very subtle button. So a button with a very subtle background color. Because if this was, for example, green, like the rest of the text here, then that button would get all the attention. But in this case, apparently, the designers wanted the focus to be on the prices and not on the button. And so that's why they basically took out the green background color and replaced it with this very subtle gray. Now, another one, here are some icons, some important data points, and then this label here is very nicely de-emphasized by being super small, but still with this uppercase text, which I think looks amazing actually. Then here, again on Instagram, there is a data point, and then these buttons here are actually really noticeable de-emphasized. And the reason for that is that Instagram doesn't want to take any attention away from the photos. All right. That's also why the mobile application is completely white, basically, except of course for all the pictures. All right. So that was a lot to take in about visual hierarchy for text elements, but we're not done yet, because now we need to talk about visual hierarchy between components. So that's also super important. And by components, essentially I mean groups of elements or big areas of content. So let's focus now on establishing visual hierarchy between components. And the way we do that is through a combination of background colors, shadows, and border. So let's take a look at an example. And so here in this design, this really bright background color really makes this section completely stand out from the rest of the page, right? And the same is true here on this website. So again, one big standout section, which is going to take all the attention right here. And of course, that is on purpose. So that's why they chose this color right here, because that is where they want the user's attention to go. And this second one actually not only uses background color, but also a nice shadow. You see that? Then this one here also uses shadow, and it uses border as well. So border and shadow, but no background color. While this next one uses, once again, exclusively background color to highlight this most important row of this table. Now, another common technique of emphasizing a component A over a component B is by simply de-emphasizing the component B. So let's say right here we have component A and B, and we want to have component A stand out more. So we could of course add maybe a border or a shadow to the left one, so to component A, but what we can also do is to simply de-emphasize component B. So it lost its background color, and now component A has been made more prominent by simply removing that background color from component B. And by the way, notice also that arrow that says free close to the Start Now button. So that is yet another way to basically emphasize that Start Now button, right? So that's not a technique I'm mentioning here in this lecture, but it's still just another way of drawing attention to that important button. So here are some more examples of de-emphasizing one component in order to emphasize the actual component that we want the user to focus on. Now, finally, just like with text elements, you now might be wondering what kinds of components you should actually draw the attention to when you're building your own designs. Well, here I have a big list of some components that we usually want to stand out from the rest of our page's content. And so let's now take a look at an example of each of them. So this is an example of a testimonial, so of someone talking about your own product, basically by trying to advertising it. Then we have call to action sections, which many times websites have like on the end of a page so that the user signs up for their product or their service. Then there are also highlight sections, as I call them, which are essentially big sections in the middle of your content, which we kind of want to stand out. And so we simply can give them, for example, a different background color like this design here does. And here are two more examples of highlight sections. And again, they use some different background color than the rest of the page to really stand out there. Then we also have preview cards, which I had mentioned before already. So basically previewing some kind of product, for example, that you're trying to sell. And so these again, many times should stand out from the rest of the content by using shadow or some kind of border. Then there are also forms, which can look like this, or pricing tables, where many times there are different pricing options. And then the designer usually highlights the one that they actually want the user to choose. So that can be done using a background color, but there are also many other options that you can choose from, as I will show you a little bit later. Because actually, we have an entire big lecture all about different components. And finally, as we already saw a bit earlier, we can also highlight or emphasize an important row or an important column in a table. And of course, this list of examples is not exhaustive. There are many components which can use some emphasizing. All right. But this lecture is already running quite long, and so let's actually implement some of these things in the next lecture. So I see you there after you hopefully finished studying this lecture some more.